Welcome to day 3. Today we're going to look at some techniques of media analysis. Today is just a regular schedule, do reading responses, and make sure you have a virtual presence as always. These two readings both address a common theme, the idea of how we deal with media that we like or love or feel very close to on the one hand, but on the other hand we have criticisms of, there's things about it that we find hurtful or problematic or just not very good. And I think that what both these try and encourage us to do is have a complexity of responses to media, rather than just asking, is something good, is it something bad? Instead, think about ways that we can appreciate certain elements of it while criticizing other elements of it. Another thing these two readings have in common is a whole number of great links, so I encourage you, if you have time, to follow some of those and look at some of the other articles that they connect to. 4 short readings to look at different ideas useful for feminist analysis of media. The first is the male gaze. The gaze is the idea that a camera decides for us, or the cinematographer, the editor, what we see in a movie. We can't look at whatever we like. We're forced to follow the gaze of the person operating the camera. And in particular, in the feminist theory of the male gaze, we look as if we were a man. So, for example, the camera may linger on a particular sexualized part of a woman's body. It may exclude a woman's face from the shot, focusing only on her body. The second concept is the Bechdel test. This is named after Alison Bechdel, a cartoonist who, among other things, is famous for a strip called Dykes to Watch Out For. And she proposes a 3-point test. The first is the movie should have 2 women. Those women should have names. The second is that those women should have a conversation with each other. And the third point is that that conversation should be about something other than a man. A shocking number of movies fail this test, and you can look at the list on the website for which ones do and which ones don't, and look at the way that that's changed over time, as well as how much money different movies make based on whether they pass this test or not. It should be noted that the Bechdel test is useful for thinking about the lack of women in Hollywood as a whole, but it doesn't necessarily tell us much about a particular movie. For example, you can easily have a movie like Gravity, for example, that has only one character. She's a female character, but because she doesn't really talk to anyone, it fails the Bechdel test. Or a movie like Sex and the City, which has a lot of female characters who talk to each other about shoes and so forth, but which isn't necessarily feminist in any way. So the Bechdel test isn't to be taken too seriously on a movie-by-movie basis. There's lots of exceptions. This does give us a general sense of the lack of representation of women in Hollywood. The last idea is the death of the author. So in traditional media criticism, people were very interested in what the author meant, what the intent of the author was in their message, and the goal of a reader would be to figure out what the ideas the author intended to get across. Since this essay by Buss, The Death of the Author, we're encouraged instead to understand that a text can have a really wide range of meanings, and that those meanings can differ depending on the person who is doing the reading, and that we shouldn't reject a reading just because it's not the reading the author intended. In fact, we shouldn't be very interested at all in what the author intended, but rather what messages come across in the piece. The third reading today, The Oppositional Gaze, is a really important reading. I think it's a really amazing, powerful reading. I recommend it. It's written by Bell Hooks, a really crucial third-wave scholar and African-American feminist. She says there is power in looking. She says that in the way in which we observe media, we can find power. She references Foucault and this idea that power is never absolute. So while it's true that there are all of these oppressive forces in society, at the same time, even the most oppressed people have some power to push back against them. And one of the powers she suggests is the ability to reinterpret media through what she calls the oppositional gaze. She mentions Emmett Till in this reading. Emmett Till's worth knowing about. He was a young black man in the South during segregation who allegedly looked at a white woman in a way that people felt was sexual. There's no evidence that it was actually intended as such, but often black men's looks were interpreted this way, and he was brutally murdered and savaged because of it. His mother, who was very courageous, agreed to have the horrible pictures of his dead body published in order to publicize the types of things that happened to black men. It was a very powerful use of an image. There's a lot of vocabulary in this piece. The first one is the gaze. As I said, there's some readings on this, but just to review, the gaze, as typically used in cinema, is the idea that the viewer looks through the camera in the same way that the filmmaker does, right? So negation is the elimination of certain people, in this case, black women, from media, from movies. So the fact that black women were very rarely shown, still are very rarely shown in media, was an act of negation. It was making it as if they did not exist. Bell Hooks also talks about agency. This is the idea of people having power to have control over their own experiences, their own environment. And it's very important to remember, as we're talking about oppressive forces, that all people have at least some degree of agency in their lives, and not to ignore the agency of oppressed people just because it's constrained in certain ways. She also talks about sites of resistance. She's talking, of course, about films here. A site of resistance is a place where oppressed people are able to exercise agency in a way that pushes back. A discourse is a narrative or a repeated story, a story which we expect to be told and are familiar with. Once we establish a story, for example, the story of overcoming, right? The idea that people face obstacles and then overcome them. This is a very common discourse in our media. Then things fall into that discourse easily. We have to examine the common discourses, the discourses that are used and reinforced, and think about, first of all, be aware of them, and also think about ways they can be challenged. Bell Hooks uses the phrase critical interrogation. This means, as critics, as people who are thoughtful about society, really investigating and taking apart the messages, the discourses that are present in our media. And the last term to know here is phallocentric, meaning phallo from phallus, meaning penis, meaning male-centered or masculine-centered media.